Imagine being drawn into a world where a single glance, a whispered word, or a hidden flash drive could shift the balance of global power. This story plunges you into the secret lives of history's most dangerous women, master manipulators, seductresses, and fearless warriors. Will you dare to follow them into the shadows? Chapter 1. Mata Hari, the seductive dancer who fooled nations. It's dawn on October 15th, 1917, in a damp cell in a Paris prison. Margaretha Zell, known to the world as Mata Hari, waits in silence. The extravagant costumes and veils that once adorned her in performances are gone, replaced by a gray prison uniform. She sits, staring into the dim shadows, as the muffled sounds of her captor's footsteps approach. Only hours remain before she faces a firing squad. And at last, the woman who once captivated all of Europe will be silenced. But her story is far from ordinary. Mata Hari, the famed dancer of Dutch origin, rose to prominence in the early 1900s for her exotic, entrancing performances, allegedly inspired by the Far East. Beneath the allure of her dances and the mystery of her veil lay a life shrouded in espionage and betrayal. By 1914, Europe was engulfed in the horrors of World War I. Tensions between nations had erupted into a brutal conflict, and every major European country was desperately vying for information on the other's plans. Spies were everywhere, and both Germany and France employed an extensive network of operatives to gain the upper hand. Mata Hari entered this world with a unique set of assets: beauty, charm, and the ability to move in elite social circles. Her provocative performances captivated audiences in Paris, Berlin, Vienna, and Madrid. She was a chameleon, changing her persona to fit any occasion, and her mysterious allure gave her access to powerful men in military and political circles. Margaretha Zell was born in the Netherlands, but when her marriage failed, she reinvented herself as Mata Hari, a persona she claimed was inspired by Indonesian dance, a far cry from her Dutch roots. Her performances, often sensual and provocative, created a sensation in the major cities of Europe. By 1915, the war had made it difficult for her to continue her career. As she struggled financially, she found herself caught between two powers, Germany and France. When a German consul approached her in the Netherlands, offering money in exchange for information, she accepted. She was given the codename H21 and tasked with gathering intelligence from the French and British men she encountered. She may not have understood the full risk at first, but soon Mata Hari's entanglement in the world of espionage grew. She agreed to pass secrets to the Germans in exchange for payment, though she had no particular loyalty to their cause. Yet Mata Hari's situation became more complicated when French intelligence learned of her dealings with the Germans. French officials suspected she was spying for the Germans under the guise of neutrality. Eager to stay out of prison and in need of money, Mata Hari approached the French and offered her services, hoping to prove her loyalty. French intelligence accepted her offer, giving her assignments under close watch. This was her first step into double-crossing. Now, she was theoretically working for both sides. As a spy, Mata Hari was unconventional. She used her charms rather than traditional intelligence techniques. High-ranking officers, diplomats, and politicians were drawn to her beauty and mystique, and her approach to espionage often revolved around seduction and intimacy. Information exchanged during pillow talk, dinners, and drinks could be as valuable as any coded message, and Mata Hari's contacts unwittingly revealed details about troop movements, supply routes, and military strategies. Her dual role, however, made her a target. She had little understanding of military intelligence and often passed on trivial information, hoping it would keep both sides satisfied. But as the war progressed and Europe became gripped by paranoia and mistrust, spies were no longer romanticized. They were feared, hunted, and executed. Both Germany and France began to doubt her loyalty, and the noose tightened around her. In 1917, French counterintelligence intercepted German communications, referring to a spy with the codename H21. The messages, although vaguely worded, provided enough for the French to realize H21 was Mata Hari. Some historians speculate that the Germans may have deliberately used her name, knowing the French were listening, to mislead their enemy or frame her. Under mounting suspicion, French officials arrested Mata Hari in Paris. She was subjected to an intense interrogation, during which she denied working as a spy for Germany. But her connections, lifestyle, and intercepted communications painted a damning picture. In the eyes of the French, she was a double agent who had sold France's secrets to its enemies. Her trial was swift and harsh, conducted in a period of national desperation and anger. France needed a scapegoat, someone to blame for the bloodshed at the front, and Mata Hari's enigmatic allure made her the perfect target. During her trial, the prosecution portrayed her as a ruthless seductress who had betrayed her host nation. Although much of the evidence was circumstantial, the public was captivated by the sensationalism surrounding her case. Newspapers and magazines printed stories that painted her as a femme fatale, weaving an image that often blurred the lines between fact and fantasy. On the morning of October 15th, Mata Hari was led to her execution. Dressed in a simple outfit, she maintained her composure, refusing a blindfold and facing the firing squad with a steely gaze. Witnesses would later remark on her courage, her refusal to break down, and her final look that haunted the men who fired the shots. Though officially executed for espionage, Mata Hari's impact was symbolic rather than tactical. Her trial and death became a cautionary tale, illustrating the dangers of a life entangled in war, secrecy, and manipulation. Her legacy as a spy is one of myth and mystery, a blend of fact and fabrication that immortalized her as the quintessential femme fatale. Mata Hari's tale endures as one of espionage, allure, and tragic consequence. Her life and death symbolizes the high-stakes game of loyalty and betrayal that defines the shadowy world of spies, where trust is a luxury and a misstep can be fatal. Chapter 2. Ursula Kaczynski, the spy who stole nuclear secrets. In 1942, in the heart of wartime London, a woman dressed in a plain overcoat, her face partially hidden by a scarf, stood in the shadows near a high-security facility. Ursula Kaczynski, known by her Soviet code name Agent Sonia, watched the scientists as they entered the facility. She knew their work was of the utmost importance to the Allied powers and, more importantly, to the Soviet Union. Her mission was clear: gather intelligence on Britain's nuclear developments and ensure that the USSR kept pace in the burgeoning arms race. Born into a German Jewish family, Ursula had been drawn to communism early in her life, inspired by its ideals and the promise of a more just society. In the 1930s, her political fervor had led her to join the Soviet intelligence agency, the GRU. Her commitment to communism burned as intensely as her disdain for fascism. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, her loyalty to the Soviet Union only deepened. She would do whatever was necessary to support the cause, even if it meant betraying her native Germany, her adopted England, and eventually the West. A brilliant organizer and meticulous planner, Ursula established herself as one of the Soviet Union's most trusted spies. Known as Sonia, she operated under the guise of an unassuming housewife, a mother of three who lived a quiet life in the English countryside. But beneath this mild exterior was a woman with nerves of steel and a mind trained in espionage. She had once trained in the mountains of China, hiding from the Japanese and evading their brutal campaigns while learning survival skills and encryption. Now, that training was serving her well in England as she embarked on her most critical assignment yet. Her role was to infiltrate the tight-knit circles of scientists and technicians working on Britain's nuclear project, part of a larger Allied effort to create the atomic bomb. Through a carefully woven web of contacts and sources, she managed to gather information about the nuclear advancements taking place under the utmost secrecy. Her process was precise and painstaking. She would receive scraps of information from multiple sources, using the details to piece together a comprehensive picture of the progress in nuclear technology. At night, she would sit alone with her radio transmitter, sending encoded messages to Moscow. Every keystroke was a risk. If the British authorities discovered her activities, the consequences would be deadly. Yet Ursula remained calm. Her dedication to the Soviet cause outweighed any fear of capture. and she operated with the determination of someone who truly believed that her actions could change the course of history. The war intensified, and so did Ursula's work. She tapped into the flow of information between Britain and the United States, where the Manhattan Project was developing the bomb. She communicated with Klaus Fuchs, a brilliant physicist working on the project who shared her ideological leanings and covertly supplied her with detailed insights. With this newfound access, Ursula's mission took on a higher level of urgency. The intelligence she passed to the Soviets allowed them to gain ground in nuclear research, ensuring they would not be left defenseless in the post-war world dominated by American military power. By 1943, British intelligence had become increasingly aware of Soviet infiltration within sensitive projects. Suspicion grew, and agents began monitoring known communists and suspected collaborators. Ursula's careful tactics and discreet network kept her identity hidden, but the threat was always present. She knew that even a single misstep could end her life, and yet she pressed on, certain that the cause justified any risk. Her cover story as an ordinary housewife was impeccable. She mingled with neighbors, attended social gatherings, and played the role of the amiable mother. The locals knew her only as Mrs. Burton, and her background as a German émigré seemed plausible enough amid the chaos of war. Yet, at night, she would turn into the stealthy agent Sonia, the woman who knew how to handle explosives and send radio signals undetected. She had lived this dual life for years, compartmentalizing her emotions, her fears, and her regrets in order to serve the mission. To her, espionage was an art of endurance as much as it was an act of courage. As she continued her work, suspicion from British counterintelligence grew ever closer. One fateful evening, Ursula sensed the tightening of the noose. She'd heard rumors of an internal investigation into Soviet agents, and a familiar car had been spotted near her house more than once. She knew her time was running out. If she wanted to survive and continue her work, she would have to disappear. In a matter of days, Ursula prepared her escape. She gathered her children and few possessions, adopted a new identity, and quietly slipped out of England. Her destination was East Germany, where she could resume her work in relative safety under Soviet protection. Ursula's departure was swift, her trail almost impossible to follow. By the time British intelligence caught wind of her movements, she had vanished, leaving only a faint trace of her existence behind. Once she reached East Germany, Ursula continued her work for the Soviet Union, but her role in the intelligence community gradually diminished as she aged. The information she had transmitted, however, had lasting consequences. The intelligence she provided was instrumental in helping the Soviet Union accelerate its own atomic bomb project. Thanks to her efforts and those of her fellow spies, the USSR detonated its first atomic bomb in 1949, sparking a nuclear arms race that would shape global politics for decades. Ursula's commitment to her ideals never wavered. She lived out her life in East Germany, where she remained a devoted communist and a figure of quiet legend among Soviet intelligence circles. She published an autobiography years later, though it provided little insight into her covert activities. Ursula Kaczynski's legacy as Agent Sonia lay not in her personal fame, but in the monumental shift she had helped to bring about. The arms race she fueled would haunt the world for decades, an invisible but ever-present reminder of the sacrifices, secrets, and betrayals made in the shadow of ideology. The spy who stole nuclear secrets had left her mark on history, an indelible trace hidden in the classified documents of Soviet and Western intelligence agencies. In the end, Ursula Kaczynski's story was not just one of espionage, but of loyalty, a loyalty that saw her betray nations, assume new identities, and risk her life, all for a cause she believed was worth the ultimate price. Chapter 3: Nancy Wake, the White Mouse who outwitted the Gestapo. Nancy Wake slipped through the darkness, her worn shoes treading silently on the narrow path. Dressed in the rough woolen clothes of a French peasant, she adjusted the worn scarf wrapped around her head, glancing up at the looming silhouettes of Nazi checkpoints ahead. The silence was thick, broken only by the distant hum of a German soldier's voice. Her heart beat steadily as she took a deep breath and moved forward. It was 1943, and the Nazis exerted complete control over occupied France. But to Nancy Wake, this was her territory too. Before the war, Nancy had been a journalist, born in New Zealand and raised in Australia. She had come to Europe for a career and stayed for love, marrying a wealthy French industrialist, Henri Fiacre. But her life transformed in 1940 when Nazi Germany swept into France, igniting in her a fury that would make her one of the most effective and feared members of the French resistance. The Gestapo would soon give her a nickname that symbolized her elusiveness, the White Mouse. Nancy was as charming as she was daring, with an unbreakable spirit that made her a natural leader. She joined the resistance almost immediately, smuggling messages, money, and weapons to support sabotage missions. Fluent in French and skilled at blending into her surroundings, Nancy became the perfect operative. She was quick-witted, always able to adapt and talk her way out of danger. She learned to lie smoothly, to flatter even the most suspicious Nazi officer with a smile, and to wield her confidence like a shield. The longer she worked with the resistance, the more dangerous her missions became. By 1942, Nancy was leading a complex network of spies, setting up escape routes for Allied soldiers and downed pilots, ferrying them through France into Spain and then to safety in England. Her bravery earned her admiration from her comrades and fear from the Nazis. The Gestapo declared her one of the most wanted people in France, placing a substantial bounty on her head. But even as her network expanded and her reputation grew, Nancy's courage and cunning never faltered. Her greatest enemy was now the Gestapo, and they were tightening their net. One of her most daring operations took place under the very noses of German soldiers. Nancy received word that a large shipment of weapons, which could fuel the resistance's efforts, was arriving in a heavily patrolled sector. She disguised herself as a street vendor, approaching checkpoints with a cart full of produce, all while concealing a load of ammunition beneath the vegetables. When a soldier stopped her, she flashed her most disarming smile and made a playful joke about his uniform fitting a little too snugly. The soldier laughed, waved her through, and Nancy carried on with the mission undetected. However, the Gestapo was closing in, and Nancy knew her time was running out. One night, German officers raided her hideout. Forced to flee, she and her husband, Henri, made a desperate escape attempt. Nancy managed to cross into Spain, but Henri was caught and killed by the Nazis, a loss that would haunt her, but also fuel her resolve. Devastated and alone, she crossed the Pyrenees into neutral Spain, carrying only the barest essentials and an iron determination to return and finish the work she'd started. In England, she joined the British Special Operations Executive, where she trained in hand-to-hand combat, weaponry, and sabotage tactics. She was now no longer just a member of the resistance. She was an Allied agent. In April 1944, Nancy parachuted back into France, landing in Auvergne with little more than a pistol and a backpack of supplies. She took command of a large guerrilla unit of over 7,000 men, directing attacks on German convoys, railways, and communication lines. Her methods were ruthless and effective. She ordered her fighters to cut down telephone poles, destroy bridges, and bomb supply lines, all crucial efforts to disrupt the German army ahead of the Allied invasion. Nancy's leadership was fierce. Her men respected her for her fearlessness, though many initially doubted that a woman could lead in war. But after a few missions, they began to call her Madame Andre, honoring her as both a fearless leader and a mother figure to the ragtag group. Nancy's command was marked by brutal skirmishes, narrow escapes, and relentless night raids. Her unit's sabotage operations wreaked havoc on the Nazis, leading to one of her most dangerous missions, the ambush of a German patrol in a remote mountain pass. In a carefully coordinated attack, Nancy's men cut off the convoy's exit points, trapping the Germans. Nancy fired the first shot, sending the patrol into a chaotic scramble. Her team hit fast, guns blazing, capturing weapons, supplies, and vital intelligence in a matter of minutes. The attack left the Nazi troops reeling, a blow that spread Nancy's reputation far beyond her hiding place in Auvergne. But the Gestapo, furious at her success, dedicated even more resources to capturing the White Mouse. They tightened their checkpoints, interrogated civilians, and increased patrols in the countryside. At one point, Nancy's hideout was surrounded by German soldiers. She slipped out the back, vanishing into the forest, evading capture once again. She navigated the woods for 3 days, surviving on little but wild berries and her own willpower, until she reached a safe house and regrouped with her fighters. By the time the Allies liberated France, Nancy Wake was a legend. Her audacious attacks had weakened German forces, paved the way for the D-Day invasion, and inspired countless others. She returned to England as one of the most decorated women of World War II, awarded the George Medal for her service, the Medal of Freedom from the United States, and the Croix de Guerre from France. In the years after the war, Nancy's story spread, cementing her place in history as one of the most effective and elusive spies the world had ever known. To her, the war had been personal. She had lost her husband, endured unimaginable hardships, and risked her life countless times. But Nancy's legacy was not one of suffering. It was one of fierce resistance, of courage, and of a determination that outwitted even the most ruthless of enemies. In the face of the Gestapo's relentless pursuit, she had lived up to her code name, slipping through the cracks time and again, forever remembered as the White Mouse. Chapter 4. Ana Montes, the Queen of Cuba's Intelligence Game. In September 2001, deep within the concrete walls of the Defense Intelligence Agency in Washington, Ana Montes sat in a high-security briefing room. Around her were senior officials, seasoned analysts, and military strategists discussing sensitive intelligence regarding U.S. operations in Latin America. Montes, calm and unassuming, listened attentively. She was one of the DIA's most respected analysts, a quiet but sharp-minded expert on Cuban affairs. To everyone in the room, Montes was simply a diligent patriot. What they didn't know was that for over 16 years, she had been playing a double game as one of Cuba's most valuable spies. Ana Montes had not been born into espionage. She had carefully chosen it. A Puerto Rican raised in America, she had developed a deep-seated opposition to U.S. policies in Latin America. During her graduate studies, she met individuals who sympathized with her views and expressed admiration for the Cuban Revolution. Montes' discontent grew into action when she made contact with Cuban intelligence agents in the early 1980s. They saw potential in this bright, idealistic woman and recognized her access to the very intelligence they craved. In time, she agreed to spy for them, not for financial gain, but because of a fervent belief in her cause. Montes saw herself as a defender of Cuba against what she considered U.S. imperialism. From the beginning, Montes handled her clandestine activities with extraordinary precision. She learned not to leave paper trails, conducted operations with minimal digital footprints, and met her handlers in coded, isolated locations. By the time she joined the DIA in 1985, Montes had already honed the craft of espionage. She ingratiated herself with her colleagues, quickly advancing within the agency thanks to her expertise and dedication. Her knowledge of Cuba's political and military landscape made her an invaluable asset. To her colleagues, she was someone who could interpret Havana's intentions with unrivaled insight, a trusted authority. Montes' espionage methods were as meticulous as they were daring. Avoiding risky electronic exchanges, she committed her findings to memory, typed reports on an outdated laptop at home, and transmitted information only when absolutely necessary. She used public telephones to communicate with Cuban contacts, often after hours of carefully planning her every move. Once a week, she would transfer her files to an encrypted radio frequency, the details of which changed frequently to avoid detection. Her ingenuity was so effective that even seasoned CIA agents, who had suspicions of leaks, could not trace the information back to her. Montes' dual life became a high-stakes performance. She managed to avoid suspicion through a network of lies, social isolation, and an almost monastic dedication to her covert mission. At work, she feigned detachment, rarely engaging in close friendships or intimate relationships, and kept her personal and professional lives strictly compartmentalized. This psychological distance enabled her to act without guilt. To her, every piece of intelligence she shared with Havana was a strike against what she saw as American injustice. Years passed, and Montes' network within the DIA expanded. Her expertise shaped U.S. policy in Latin America, and every report she wrote was imbued with subtle biases that mirrored her personal beliefs. But her biggest act of betrayal came in 1996 when she informed Cuba of an impending U.S. military action in Latin America. The leaked information allowed Cuban forces to prepare and counteract, a blow that led to strategic shifts in U.S. intelligence operations across the region. The incident left U.S. officials baffled and weakened, unaware that the source of the leak was sitting within their ranks. Despite her careful methods, her work didn't go completely unnoticed. By the late 1990s, the FBI began to suspect a mole within the intelligence community, specifically someone with access to sensitive information on Latin America. Montes' name surfaced during a sweeping internal investigation, but there was little evidence to directly implicate her. She carried on, her confidence unshaken, even as the net gradually tightened around her. In September 2001, as the world's attention focused on the recent attacks in New York City and Washington, D.C., federal agents closed in. The FBI had gathered enough circumstantial evidence to justify surveillance, and they tapped her phone and monitored her computer activities. Weeks of round-the-clock scrutiny revealed small, calculated moves, encrypted messages, secret meetings, and conversations that subtly betrayed her divided loyalties. Finally, in late September 2001, federal agents arrested Ana Montes at her office. The news of her capture reverberated through the intelligence community. She had been the last person anyone suspected, a reserved, disciplined professional who, to her colleagues, had only ever demonstrated unwavering dedication to her country. As she was escorted out of the DA, her colleagues were left in shock, reeling from the discovery that someone so trusted had deceived them for so long. During the subsequent interrogation, Montes confessed her role as a Cuban spy. Her motives were not complex. She cited her ideological beliefs, her disdain for American foreign policy, and her loyalty to Cuba. But even as she confessed, she did so with an air of calm conviction, unapologetic for the years of betrayal that had crippled U.S. intelligence operations in Latin America. Ana Montes' treachery marked one of the most damaging security breaches in U.S. intelligence history. The scale of her betrayal was unprecedented, with her intelligence leaks putting U.S. agents and informants in peril. The revelation exposed vulnerabilities in the country's counterintelligence processes, forcing a dramatic overhaul of security protocols. Sentenced to 25 years in prison, Montes displayed little remorse for her actions. Even behind bars, she remained loyal to her ideals, steadfastly believing that her actions had been justified. To some, she was a traitor of the highest order. To others, a woman driven by an uncompromising commitment to her beliefs. Montes' legacy as the queen of Cuba's intelligence game endures in the annals of espionage, her story serving as a stark reminder of the power of conviction and the risks that ideological spies pose to national security. For the intelligence community, her deception was a painful lesson, one that underscored the necessity for vigilance, loyalty checks, and the relentless pursuit of truth, even within the innermost ranks of trust. Ana Montes had indeed outplayed the most secure intelligence agency in the world, and her story remains one of the most infamous accounts of espionage ever uncovered in modern times. Chapter 5. Virginia Hall, the limping lady who terrorized the Nazis. It was 1944 in occupied France, and the night air was thick with tension. In a dimly lit hideout, Virginia Hall sat at a table, her sharp eyes scanning a map of local villages. Her prosthetic leg, nicknamed Cuthbert, rested heavily against the chair, a reminder of the physical limitations that never stopped her. Word had arrived that Nazi forces were preparing sweeping raids across the countryside. Any sensible operative would retreat. But Virginia Hall was no ordinary spy. With a quiet resolve, she traced the routes the Germans would likely take, already planning her next move. Virginia Hall was an unlikely spy. Born in Baltimore, Maryland, she had dreamed of a career in foreign service, but found her ambitions blocked when she lost her left leg in a hunting accident. Undeterred, she continued her studies and became fluent in several languages. By the time World War II erupted, Her fierce desire to serve had led her to France, and she became one of the first female agents to join the British Special Operations Executive. Known as the Limping Lady due to her prosthetic leg, Virginia's resilience and skill soon made her one of the Allies' most valuable spies. When she first arrived in France in 1941, Virginia worked under deep cover, posing as an American journalist. Her SOE training had been rigorous, teaching her the deadly skills of espionage, sabotage, and survival behind enemy lines. She quickly established a covert network across France, organizing safe houses, recruiting locals, and coordinating arms drops. Virginia was a master of disguise and often changed her appearance to elude the Gestapo. She could blend into a crowd effortlessly, one day a prim secretary and the next a humble milkmaid. Virginia's network proved invaluable to the French resistance. Under her guidance, resistance fighters ambushed German convoys, blew up train tracks, and sabotaged critical infrastructure. The Gestapo soon realized they were facing a formidable opponent. To them, she was known as the most dangerous of all Allied spies. They issued orders to capture her at any cost, broadcasting her description throughout occupied France. Yet no matter how close they came, Virginia always stayed a step ahead. The Gestapo's relentless pursuit reached a boiling point in late 1942. After a tip-off that her network had been compromised, Virginia had no choice but to flee Lyon, where she had been based. She had little time to prepare. With her cover blown, staying in France was suicidal. The only escape route was to cross the Pyrenees into neutral Spain, a grueling journey that would test even the strongest. But Virginia was determined. With few supplies and Cuthbert making each step excruciating, Virginia set off into the mountains. Winter had turned the Pyrenees into a brutal, snow-covered obstacle. Each night, as temperatures dropped, her prosthetic leg chafed and her muscles screamed in pain. But she pressed on, driven by sheer willpower. She was often reduced to crawling up icy inclines, her breaths coming in sharp gasps as the thin mountain air filled her lungs. The journey took her across treacherous terrain, evading German patrols as she made her way to freedom. When she finally reached Spain, exhausted and frostbitten, she was taken into custody by Spanish authorities who didn't realize her true identity. After days in detention, she managed to contact the American embassy, securing her release. Virginia could have returned to England, left the war behind, and recuperated. Instead, she insisted on going back to the front lines. Her work wasn't finished. The Allies were planning the invasion of Normandy, and they needed operatives on the ground to pave the way. Returning to occupied France in 1944, Virginia now worked under the codename Diane for the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA. This time, she led a team of resistance fighters in central France, where she organized sabotage operations and trained guerrilla units. She had no radio operator, so she transmitted her own messages, risking detection each time she relayed crucial intelligence back to the Allies. Her days were spent plotting attacks on German supply lines, orchestrating ambushes, and coordinating parachute drops of weapons and supplies. Her reputation among the resistance grew, with locals speaking of her bravery in hushed tones. Her men revered her and followed her lead in even the most dangerous missions. They marveled at her courage, watching as she limped through villages, rallying them against the Nazi forces that seemed unstoppable. Her physical limitations only fueled their admiration. The woman with the iron leg had become a legend, and her presence was a rallying cry. Virginia's efforts were instrumental in the months leading up to the D-Day invasion. Her network disrupted German communications, cut off reinforcements, and destroyed key railways, leaving German forces scrambling to maintain control. The Gestapo knew she was back, and the bounty on her head grew. But Virginia was always just out of reach, slipping through their fingers like a shadow. Her disguises and clever maneuvers kept her one step ahead, and the Nazi forces never managed to capture her. As the Allied invasion swept through France, Virginia continued her work, moving with the advancing troops, gathering intelligence, and coordinating resistance attacks to clear paths for the Allies. The fearsome limping lady had terrorized the Nazis with her iron will, proving that courage could overcome even the most daunting obstacles. When France was finally liberated, Virginia's work was over, but her legacy had only begun. She returned to the United States as one of the most decorated female spies of the war, receiving the Distinguished Service Cross from the OSS, the only civilian woman to receive the honor during World War II. Her fellow agents and resistance fighters hailed her as a hero, the woman who had struck fear into the hearts of the Gestapo and had become a symbol of resilience in the face of tyranny. Yet Virginia Hall never sought fame. She quietly retired, shunning the spotlight, her name largely forgotten in the annals of history. But for those who had known her, for the people she had saved, and for the Nazis who had feared her, the limping lady was unforgettable, a silent, relentless force who proved that one person, no matter how unlikely, could change the course of war. Chapter 6. Sue Dobson, the South African Spy. In the twilight of apartheid South Africa, when the government's iron grip on the nation seemed impenetrable, a quiet storm was brewing within the system itself. Sue Dobson, a white South African woman, lived her life under the radar, seemingly an unassuming journalist. But beneath the surface, she harbored a secret so dangerous it could cost her life. A recruit of the African National Congress Intelligence Network, Dobson's role was anything but ordinary. She had been sent by the ANC to infiltrate South Africa's apartheid regime, to tear away the veil of secrecy the government had so carefully woven. The year was 1985, and Dobson had already proved herself as an invaluable asset to the ANC. Having spent time in exile in the Soviet Union for intensive espionage training, she had returned to South Africa, camouflaged as an everyday journalist, a perfect cover for someone trying to avoid suspicion in a racially divided society. The apartheid government, notoriously paranoid about spies, had no idea that Dobson was one of them. Her true mission: to gather intelligence on military operations, government strategies, and the inner workings of a regime determined to maintain its grip on power. Dobson's training in the Soviet Union had been nothing short of grueling. The Cold War had created a landscape where alliances were forged in the shadows, and the ANC was no stranger to operating behind enemy lines. Armed with state-of-the-art surveillance tools and the ability to blend seamlessly into the fabric of white South African society, Dobson could move freely through military zones and government offices, all the while feeding critical information to the ANC. Her training covered everything from avoiding detection to subtle methods of extracting classified documents without raising suspicion. Every move was calculated, each mission carrying immense risk. But her role was not without complications. South Africa was under a state of emergency, and the government had stepped up its efforts to root out any form of subversion. Dobson's every move was a delicate dance, as she worked tirelessly to gather intelligence while avoiding the attention of the apartheid security forces. The government had implemented a sophisticated surveillance apparatus, with informants planted in almost every corner of the country. Dobson, aware of this, carefully cultivated her network of informants and contacts, always keeping her true allegiance hidden. Her journalistic work gave her access to important circles that would have been off-limits to most. She attended closed-door meetings where military strategies were discussed, and she became a trusted source in the very circles that were responsible for enforcing apartheid's brutal policies. Yet, the stakes were always high. Dobson had to navigate a web of government paranoia, where even the smallest mistake could lead to her discovery. The tension surrounding her covert life grew increasingly intense as her mission deepened. The South African government had grown increasingly aware of the threat posed by spies within their ranks. As Dobson infiltrated deeper into the political and military heart of the regime, the risk of exposure grew. She learned that the government was preparing for a full-scale military operation in neighboring Angola, a development that would be disastrous for the ANC if it were not intercepted. Dobson, working in the shadows, passed on the intelligence, giving the ANC a critical advantage in their fight. But the closer Dobson came to uncovering crucial information, the closer she came to danger. The apartheid regime, with its elaborate network of spies and counterintelligence officers, was tightening its grip. It wasn't long before Dobson's activities caught the attention of the government security apparatus. The alarm bells rang as intelligence officers began piecing together the evidence of a spy within their midst. The noose was slowly tightening around her. In the dead of night, Dobson was forced to go underground. Her every step was now a matter of life and death. She had to vanish from South Africa and seek refuge in a country where the regime's reach could no longer touch her. But leaving the country was not a simple task. South Africa's borders were heavily guarded, and fleeing meant crossing into neighboring countries where anti-apartheid guerrilla groups and foreign intelligence agencies had their own interests. It was a perilous escape that would require all of Dobson's cunning and resourcefulness. Through a network of underground contacts, Dobson made her way toward Botswana, knowing that once she crossed the border, she would be safe, at least for the time being. As she crossed into Botswana's territory, she looked back one last time at the land she had fought so hard to protect. South Africa's brutal apartheid government might have been closing in, but Dobson's work was far from over. Upon reaching London, Dobson sought asylum and disappeared into the shadows of exile. The ANC's struggle continued, and Dobson's role, though largely unknown, was critical in undermining the South African regime. Her actions, though covert, were integral in giving the ANC intelligence that helped turn the tide in their favor, ultimately contributing to the fall of apartheid. Sue Dobson's story remained hidden for years. Her work, which she carried out with unimaginable risks, was largely unknown to the public until much later. It wasn't until after the end of apartheid that her story began to surface. In her memoir Burned, The Spies South Africa Never Caught, Dobson recounted her dangerous life as a covert operative. The book is a testament to her courage, determination, and the high stakes of espionage. The legacy of Sue Dobson is a legacy of quiet heroism. She was a white South African who dared to fight against the very system that she was born into, and she did so from within. Her intelligence work helped weaken a regime that seemed invincible, and her role in the ANC's struggle for freedom was crucial. Dobson, whose story was almost lost to history, serves as a reminder of the unseen battles fought by those who risk everything for justice. Her life shows that sometimes the most powerful agents of change are those who work in silence, behind enemy lines, to make the impossible possible. Chapter 7. Christine Granville, Churchill's favorite spy and assassin. It was 1944 in Nazi-occupied Italy, and Christine Granville's parachute drifted slowly through the moonlit sky. She kept her body steady, bracing for the landing, even as her mind calculated her next move. As her boots touched the ground, she gathered her parachute, hid it in the brush, and quickly checked her bearings. With only the faint rustle of leaves and the distant sound of German patrols, Christine was utterly calm. This was the life she'd chosen, and she knew exactly what was at stake. Born Christina Skarbek, Christine Granville had Polish roots and a burning desire to fight against the Nazis who had invaded her homeland. Her father, a Polish aristocrat, had instilled in her a sense of fearlessness, while her adventurous spirit and fierce loyalty drove her to become one of Churchill's most effective and favorite agents. Known for her beauty and charm, Christine was also as ruthless as she was courageous, gaining a reputation for daring missions that left her enemies in shambles and her allies in awe. Christine began her work in the early days of the war, leveraging her Polish contacts to gather crucial intelligence for the British. Fluent in multiple languages and skilled in subterfuge, she became one of the first women recruited by Britain's Special Operations Executive, an organization dedicated to espionage, sabotage, and guerrilla warfare. Her missions took her across Europe, from Poland to Egypt to France, each assignment more dangerous than the last. In Poland, Christine's resourcefulness proved invaluable. She crossed treacherous terrain and Nazi-occupied borders to deliver intelligence, rally the resistance, and protect her compatriots. Christine's reputation among her peers grew, and soon even the Nazis began to hear of the elusive spy who seemed immune to capture. Her beauty and charm made her difficult to suspect, but those who underestimated her soon learned that she was far more than she appeared. Her most legendary exploits began when she was assigned to North Africa and later to occupied France, where her role expanded beyond espionage into assassination and sabotage. In France, her life became a series of narrow escapes and audacious rescues. On one occasion, her comrades were captured by German soldiers and faced imminent execution. Christine devised a plan to save them, but it was brutal and risky. She made her way to the prison where her friends were held and demanded an audience with the German officer in charge. With a calm yet steely demeanor, Christine told the officer that she was a British agent and that if her comrades were executed, the Allied forces would retaliate tenfold. Her boldness startled the officer, and she used the moment of hesitation to gain his trust. Leaning in, she whispered that she was in possession of valuable intelligence that could benefit the German army, luring him into a sense of security. The officer, intrigued, led her away from the cell block, granting Christine the opportunity to strike. In a swift, cold-blooded move, she drew a hidden knife and killed him, swiftly unlocking the cells to free her friends. Her actions that day saved lives, but she never spoke of it, moving on to her next mission as though it were routine. Christine's resolve became her armor. She was relentless, constantly adapting to her surroundings, slipping through checkpoints with ease and bluffing her way past enemy soldiers with stories so convincing that even her captors were often left questioning her identity. Her quick thinking and nerves of steel turned her into a nearly mythical figure among the SOE, admired for her fearlessness and her willingness to do whatever was necessary. But even the most seasoned spies could find themselves in deadly situations. One of her closest calls came when she was stationed in France, where the Gestapo had set their sights on her. During a reconnaissance mission, Christine found herself cornered by German soldiers who suspected her true identity. With no weapons at hand and escape seeming impossible, she turned to her greatest asset, her charisma. Christine spoke to the soldiers in flawless French, convincing them she was nothing more than a harmless traveler, a local woman who posed no threat. Her disarming smile and quiet confidence worked wonders. After several tense minutes, the soldiers relented, allowing her to walk free. Once again, Christine's unparalleled ability to manipulate and misdirect had saved her life. As she walked away from the encounter, she knew her time in France was limited. The Gestapo would be relentless in tracking her, but Christine refused to back down. With Allied support increasing in Europe, her operations grew bolder, targeting larger German installations and vital supply lines that left the Nazi war machine scrambling. She directed sabotage missions against railways and communication lines, weakening the German hold on France and paving the way for the Allied advance. In her final months in France, Christine's legend continued to grow. She faced danger with a smile, often taking on missions that even her male counterparts hesitated to attempt. Her fame even reached Winston Churchill, who lauded her as one of his favorite spies, a compliment she accepted with humility. To Christine, her work was not about fame. It was about justice, revenge, and loyalty to those she fought beside. Christine Granville's work didn't end until the very last days of the war. As Nazi forces retreated and France was liberated, she continued to operate, taking on assignments that required her unique blend of cunning, charm, and ruthlessness. Even after the Allies triumphed, Christine's life of espionage haunted her, for her heart was still tied to the sacrifices made and lives lost. After the war, Christine tried to find her place in a world no longer on the brink of destruction. But the peace that settled over Europe felt foreign to her. She had lived too long in the shadows, too accustomed to the thrill of danger. Though she received numerous awards for her service, including the George Medal, Christine struggled with civilian life. Tragically, her life came to an end in 1952 when a man infatuated with her stabbed her in a London hotel. Her death was sudden and violent, an eerie reminder of the world of darkness she had inhabited. But her legacy as one of Churchill's most daring spies and assassins endured. Christine Granville, with her boundless courage, steely resolve, and indomitable spirit, would be remembered as one of World War II's most formidable operatives. In the annals of espionage, she remained a legend, a woman who defied danger, outwitted death, and fought fearlessly for the liberation of Europe.